This week's episode of Cosmic Shenanigans is brought to you by Death Highway, the debut novella by J.C. Walsh, a high-octane cosmic horror thrill ride. Ever since Randy Jones suffered horrible burns from a street race gone wrong, he gained a terrible knowledge. An alternate dimension called the Red Plane has slowly begun to consume this world and other versions of it. Once the convergence spreads to people, they collide with themselves and start to change into something otherworldly. As Randy battles his own mind and the creatures of the Red Plane, he sets out to find Midnight Beauty, his 1972 Oldsmobile, save the woman he loves, and reassemble his crew. There's only one solution to end this madness. Randy needs to go deeper into the Red Plane. He has to drive down Death Highway. Death Highway by J.C. Walsh, available right now on Amazon in both paperback and ebook.
Welcome to Shenanigans Ensue with
Mary SanGiovanni!
Hi folks, this is Brian Keene, filling in for Mary SanGiovanni. Thanks for tuning in to Cosmic Shenanigans. This week's episode is actually something special. It's an excerpt from the Horror Show with Brian Keene, in which Mary, myself, sound engineer Dave Thomas, and our other co-host Matt Wildison of Grindcast all talk about Ramsey Campbell's seminal cosmic horror collection, Alone with the Horrors. Here's that show now.
Well, I don't think that, anybody who knows me is not going to be surprised that I love Ramsey stuff.
What?
I know.
What?
I know. Quelle surprise.
Where's the shocked noise?
I always say, some people want to be, Stephen King when they grow up. I kind of want to be Ramsey Campbell when I grow up.
And if I may interrupt, I've known you 20 years. People think we've been dating all that time. No.
Right.
We were friends. You told me that the first time we met. It was at a World Horror, and I said, what do you dream of being? I'm a be Stephen King crossed with the splatter punks. I want his money and their attitude.
Right.
And you said, I just want to be Ramsey Campbell.
Yeah, I do.
Yeah.
Because to me, I think he's accomplished the things that I would like to accomplish. He has readers who love his work. He's been recognized by his peers, with awards and accolades as somebody who is not only incredibly talented, but has contributed significantly to horror in a way that, he's a permanent fixture, I think, in the pantheon of horror literature gods. You know what I mean? Now, what I find interesting, it's definitely quiet horror, and which I love, because I think that there's something that is, sometimes so incredibly terrifying about what you don't see and what you don't know. And it's in the tradition of M.R. James, which is when we get back to that sort of English supernaturalism historical tradition that, M.R. James was quiet. M.R. James had a sense of humor. He was pretty funny, and he was sort of overtly funny, but he was
right.
quiet ghost stories too,
right.
Now, according to the introduction, after the violence of World War I, that kind of fell out of favor. People thought, quiet horror didn't really. What was like a ghost bumping around in an old house compared to the violence they saw in World War I? But Ramsey Campbell found a way to bring it back. And partly it was, what worked, I think, for a lot of people in the 60s and 70s in terms of just modernizing the genres that they loved by bringing it kind of into, bringing old school horror into the modern world, And that's basically what he does. And he uses 20th and 21st century horrors of a small blue collar area in England that that he knows so well, and he puts them in a supernatural framework. Now, the intro says, quote, that his themes are urban decay, institutional disintegration, paranoia, loneliness, neurotic anxiety, sexual repression, loss of identity. All are accorded spectral expression amid a surreally shifting chiaroscuro of reality and unreality. And that kind of captures, I think, what I like about it. Because he's writing about these supernatural horrors, which are on one level the overt horror of the story, but he's also writing about the sort of reprehensible or tragic elements of humanity, which is a second level of horror.
Right.
So, like I said, he writes about areas he knows well. Everybody has that sort of Castle Rock, but for him, his Castle Rock is more or less, it's Britechester, Lower Britechester, you know, where he writes about, and the novels I've read sort of take place in that general area. The short stories, I think almost all of them in the collection take place in that general area. And he builds up these mythologies around this area, mostly subterranean things going on under the city. But it's like he knows every crack in the pavement of every street. He knows every sighing, shifting foundation of every building, you know. And there's a sense of history there that you don't often get in American horror fiction. And I suspect that it sort of parallels the idea that our country as a you know, European descent country is not that old. Mm-hmm. So I don't think there's that sort of grand historical, you know, thousands of years perspective that makes its way into European stuff more than it does. It's in their architecture, it's in their culture.
As I've often pointed out, you go to visit Europe, you go to the UK or anywhere in Europe, most of the buildings you'll be in, or many of them, are older than our nation.
Yes,
you know,
exactly.
So there's just a lot more history there,
right,
which we don't have.
And I think that, you know, one of the things that we had talked about at MoCon is that there's certain inherent things that make their way into a story. Usually they're cultural, you know, that make it hard sometimes to replicate that style or replicate that kind of character in a realistic way, because if you're not part of that experience, you don't have that inherent aspect to draw on. But with him, I mean, there is that sense of history there. It's in everything. And there's also a sense of this sort of quiet stoicism in the face of slow decay. You know, they said there's an urban decay, but it's not just decay of the surrounding area. It's almost a decay of the people sometimes. You know, it's a decay of humanity or common sense.
That's what speaks to me.
Yeah. Or it's a decay of morality somehow. Or sometimes it's just it's a financial decay that the people can't help, which leads to a certain level of tragedy. There's a sense that there is the darkly surreal underside of the place, and that it's seeping upwards, you know, almost defying gravity and physics and biology, and it's creeping topside into the mundane. And I always like that. That's that element of, even when it's not cosmic horror by the strictest standards, there's always a sense of that otherworldly, which I love. And the areas themselves, like the Lower Britechester and the areas around the beach and stuff, they're quaint and British and functional, but often they're kind of reminiscent of a man looking up from, say, like toiling in a field to find that the night snuck up on him and he's not quite ready to go home yet. Like, that's the sense I get with a lot of these, you know, these places, is that the people are finally starting to look around and see that, oh, shit, you know, things are falling apart. And it's almost hard to watch. It's hard to watch the realization moment that people know things are falling apart.
Right.
You know, he mentions in his own foreword that he wanted to achieve that sense of supernatural terror which derives from the everyday urban landscape rather than invading it. And see, he does both, I think. He does invade the everyday urban landscape,
particularly in later works.
But I think if you were to ask him where the true horror is, it's in the situation that existed before the supernatural. The supernatural is really almost just like an impetus to examining the society that it's happening in. And then I have specific notes about some of them, about specific stories. I didn't hit every story, because, you know, I could talk about this for hours and hours. So I'm going to try to, you know, keep it tight here. But there are certain things certain stories I picked out because, to me, they're examples of why I picked the book in the first place, you know, or they're just favorite stories of mine. But, like, in the version that we read the Arkham House version. So our first story was The Room in the Castle. Now, I understand from what you guys said that the story you read was basically a pastiche of Lovecraft.
Yeah.
So is The Room in the Castle. Now he says in his foreword that he acknowledges that we learn basically to write from what we love and by imitating it, and that's okay. We imitate till we find our own voice.
Yeah, there's nothing
now,
wrong with that.
In structure and language, this story is obviously influenced by Lovecraft's style. I mean, down to the way he even puts the story together, puts the lines together. There's the intro that sort of speculates about the human condition, about how we're drawn to the remnants of the elder world, and how, he wonders if that's just something in human nature or if it's just him. And of course, he said in interviews, and I think he said in intros to other books that he had contributed significantly in the early part of his career to the Lovecraft mythos overall. So much so that the entities that he created, the gods he created, have become part of the pantheon of the Cthulhu elder god mythos, which is kind of cool in and of itself. I mean, his gods are as legit as Lovecraft's gods, But he mentions the Necronomicon, he mentions Cthulhu, he mentions Shub-Niggurath. I never know if I'm saying her name right.
That's correct.
And, he takes on the epistolary dissemination of information, which Lovecraft did frequently. It has a wizard that calls up monsters with black magic. There's a subterranean lair, as there always is in Lovecraft. And there's an ancient godlike entity, which is kept in place, and the people are protected from it by a star-shaped stone. I mean, even, like I said, even the structure, even the way in which the climax is presented is done the way Lovecraft does it, which is essentially to gloss over that moment of horror when it happens chronologically in the story, so that at the end, as the big reveal, he can come back and then tell you, right, this is what happened during that moment, and this is the essence of the horror.
This week's episode of Cosmic Shenanigans is brought to you by Death Highway, the debut novella by J.C. Walsh, a high-octane cosmic horror thrill ride. Ever since Randy Jones suffered horrible burns from a street race gone wrong, he gained a terrible knowledge. An alternate dimension called the Red Plane has slowly begun to consume this world and other versions of it. Once the convergence spreads to people, they collide with themselves and start to change into something otherworldly. As Randy battles his own mind and the creatures of the Red Plane, he sets out to find Midnight Beauty, his 1972 Oldsmobile, save the woman he loves, and reassemble his crew. There's only one solution to end this madness. Randy needs to go deeper into the Red Plane. He has to drive down Death Highway. Death Highway by J.C. Walsh, available right now on Amazon in both paperback and ebook.
Now, I think again, like I said, I think as Ramsey's style progressed, it went from the Lovecraftian, which is like, the great big horror is the fact that this thing is here, to a significant shift toward the fact that the thing is here is only highlighting what the real horror of the story is. And I mean, I think that's a progression of cosmic horror in general toward modern cosmic horror, which I think has a lot to do with people who write cosmic horror being influenced by Ramsey Campbell. Now, you can see an evolution of style in Cold Print, which is also a cosmic horror story, but it's less Lovecraft and more Ramsey Campbell. For example, I have little quotes from some of the stories which I think are just excellent pieces of literature. They really are. As he had closed the door beneath its tongueless bell, he had imagined that he had heard a cry somewhere near, quickly cut off. No doubt, round here you hear that sort of thing all the time, he thought, and turned on the other. Ramsey does that a lot in stories. He does it a lot in his novels, where the tiniest little detail is worked in, because if you're writing something and you bring up a detail that seems incongruent, like if somebody's in the car and something comes on the radio, to say that the thing comes on the radio telegraphs to the reader, this is important that this thing is on the radio. So sometimes it's hard to build up that sneaking suspense that things are going on in the background that the main character isn't noticing, and sometimes the reader doesn't notice until the monster's on you, basically.
Right.
Ramsey Campbell can do it, and he does it that way. He does it in working in these little details where what initially starts to build tension are things that would otherwise be dismissed. But because he can he can either personify them or parallel them somehow to things that are genuinely scary in that subtle, quiet kind of way. You're starting to feel tense or scared before you even know why, which I think is really incredibly brilliant. Now, this is one of, not the first story, but one of the first stories about essentially his version of the Necronomicon, which is the revelations of Glaaki. Glaaki. I looked up how to pronounce it. It's Glaaki.
I've been saying Glaaki all my life.
I have too. I know, but I looked it up. Because
I'm stunned that we are incorrect here.
Because I looked it up, and I think the Arkham House pronunciation key has it listed as Glaaki. If that's not it, I apologize, but...
Do we have an Arkham House pronunciation key?
I don't know.
We have all the... Arkham House used to send out a fanzine newsletter.
Yeah.
We have all of those.
We'll have to look.
We have an extensive Arkham House collection. It would be... That's something we should buy.
We should, because when looking at it, I mean, he has a whole host of other entities that I bring up that I'm probably going to butcher the pronunciation, but because that is one of his best known monsters, I did look it up, and it seems to be that the common consensus is that it's Glaaki, or Glaaki. So, anyway, the Revelations of Glaaki, it's a sort of Bible. What?
You're doing that. I in my head, I had Jam Master Jay on the turntable.
This is
what I'm working with, people.
And we're the morons.
This is what I'm working with here. The quote says, "You probably won't know the Revelations of Glaaki. It's a sort of Bible written under supernatural guidance. There were only 11 volumes, but this is the 12th, written by a man at the top of Mercy Hill, guided through his dreams." So it is essentially like a very Lovecraftian type of book. It's his, the mysteries of the worm, or, his unexpressed, I can't even, never pronounce that right.
Yeah.
Anyway, this particular entity first appeared in The Inhabitant of the Lake in 1964. It was an early story that he wrote. And most recently in his 2013, The Last Revelation of Glaaki. So so both the entity and the reference to this book are one that, if you're a fan of Ramsey Campbell's stuff, it becomes recognizable. And then the paragraph that they quote from it, I think, sort of sums up Ramsey Campbell's contribution to cosmic horror in terms of the pantheon. It says, "And so may Igolanak return to walk among men and await the time that the earth is cleared off and Cthulhu rises from his tomb among the weeds. Glaaki thrusts open the crystal trap door. The blood of Ihort are born into... the brood of Ihort are born into daylight. Shub-Niggurath strides forth to smash the moon lens. Biatus bursts forth from his prison. Daeloth tears away illusion to expose the reality concealed behind." So these are the entities that he has intermingled with, Lovecraft's entities, and part of Ramsey Campbell's contribution to horror literature is his contribution to the Cthulhu mythos. So it seemed worth, sort of addressing that. Now,
Absolutely.
Some of the other stories that I love, and it has a lot to do with how he tells the story, like his use of language. He has a tendency to personify inanimate objects in a kind of creepy way, which I think is a tradition that goes back to like Arthur Machen and stuff, where the personification of the setting is part of the scary. It's almost like it's an entity in and of itself.
Right.
He has a story called The Guy, and it's about Guy Fawkes Day, which we don't have in America, and I had to look up, and I'm not sure I understand it completely, but it's almost like a 4th of July.
Yeah.
There's a big bonfire and fireworks and whatnot,
yeah.
And they burn an effigy of this guy.
It's V for Vendetta.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay.
Just read
basically.
that. It's historically accurate.
It's historically accurate. This is what I'm working with, people.
Watch the movie. It sums it up well too. That's historically accurate as well.
But in this story, I found this to be one of the most tragic stories. I mean, it's beautifully written, but it's difficult. It's difficult to read. A lot of his stories are about how people fall apart. In this part, and a lot of times it has to do with the disconnect between parents and children, which is often heartbreaking. In this particular story, though, it deals with class differences and the prejudice that exists on both sides. that this poorer family, the Turner family, moves into a somewhat more upscale neighborhood, and they maybe don't belong there. At least some of them don't belong there. But they would never have had a chance anyway, because the people don't really give them a chance. And there's tragedy in this story. There's secrets about guilt and blame. And then, of course, there's the supernatural framework, which almost suggests, as a lot of his stories do, that, and like in Silent Hill, that the supernatural part of it is just a manifestation of
your own fear,
mm-hmm. and or your own guilt.
Yeah.
That's definitely the case in that story. As I said, often the obvious supernatural horror and the underlying horror of the sometimes repugnant nature of humanity are intertwined, and the real horror is the human horror. The Man in the Underpass was always one of my favorite stories.
I rather like this one too.
This is a distant first person kind of thing, which is almost like what they do in. They've done in other things. I think The Girl Next Door is sort of told this way. And there's a couple other short stories, famous short stories, although I apologize, the name is escaping me. But basically what happens is the story is told first person from an 11-year-old girl named Lynn. And in a way, it's more horrible because it's not Lynn's story. It's Tanya's story, okay? But Lynn is seeing the events unfold the way an 11-year-old girl would. So she's not really connecting them all. But you as an adult reading the story, you are connecting them. And it's pretty horrible. And again, this is one of those stories which may or may not just be about the sexual abuse of children. It could be about a real monster. And I tend to think that, because I tend to do this too, if there's a supernatural element, the supernatural element is real. But in this particular story, it is somewhat vague as to whether or not this is just imagination and how little kids perceive it or not. Now, I did look up the Aztec god because they kept saying it was Popocatépetl, and I'm not sure if that's exactly how to pronounce it, if I'm pronouncing it right, but I did look it up, and it's a volcano in Mexico, like he says, but the mythology behind it is like a Romeo and Juliet story. This Popocatépetl was a warrior, and he wanted to marry this princess, and the father said, no, you can't unless you go and destroy my enemy. So he went off to do it, and he won. But the princess was told that he died. So she got sick and died of a broken heart before he could get back. And when he died, he was just so crushed that he killed himself too. And the gods felt bad for them and made them volcanoes. So the Popocatépetl, that volcano is the only active one. Because they say it watches over the other one who's sleeping. Which I thought was kind of cute. Now, what this says at the store, that he happened to use that, and I'm not sure if this was intentional or not, is that if that's the case, that's a real distortion of love. Which, honestly, those who abuse children sexually, it's a distortion of love in their minds.
Right.
Yeah.
Which I think makes it a little bit more horrible, is that you have this figure who's known to be, in Aztec mythology, a symbol for romantic love, and because it's graffiti of this guy, it's almost like, oh, we got the bizarro version of it, we got the deficient version of it, the twisted, perverted version of it, because it's not the real god. What she summons is the graffiti version of this god, which is bad. The companion, I mentioned that one. That was the carnival one.
Mm-hmm. Right.
I'd argue that this is also a story about relationships between adults and children. A lot of times he addresses the damage that can carry with you into adulthood from things that happened to you in childhood. We talked about the bunny, there's the oversized armchair with the clothes that look like children's clothes. There's the mirror, all of these things to me are... he thinks he sees his parents, both of whom are already dead, before the story starts.
Right.
He sees them in line at this carnival prior to going to the ghost train on the other side of town. These are parents that essentially instilled nyctophobia in this guy when he was a child, because they refused to let him have a nightlight, and it terrified him. And so he's still afraid of the dark. And I think it's a lot of these stories, and I wouldn't dare speculate on what kind of relationship Ramsey Campbell has with his parents, but that is a common theme that comes up in a lot of his stories about the cruelness of parents toward children, and how basically these people just sort of develop emotional scar tissue over it, and how sometimes that scar tissue is scraped away by these supernatural events. Several stories, as I mentioned, seem to suggest strained relationships between grown children and their parents. My favorite story is The Voice of the Beach. Yeah. To me, this is everything I think a short story should be, especially a cosmic horror short story. We've got a glowing, shape-shifting corner of another dimension that overlaps ours. We've got sands that make patterns, which are essentially a language. The sand can shapeshift into debris on the beach so people don't know any better, and there's an overall entity that's sort of observing things that exists, in this overlap of dimensions that just happen to take place on the beach. It's beautifully written. It's a fantastic concept, and it's genuinely eerie. It's genuinely unsettling, There's a lot of stories like that. There's, Macintosh Willie, which another story that stuck in my head about it's kind of like the Interlopers, where children go and play someplace they shouldn't. But to me, those kind of stories are about processing death, especially when children process death. I mean, again, I think some of this is post World War I, World War II, where, England was gutted by bombs, and I think that there's sort of a trauma there. There's sort of a lasting trauma of children being exposed to death long before they should, death and destruction, and that it hangs with them, it stays with them, and one other thing I wanted to address, because I know I've been talking a long time, but this is Ramsey Campbell, so come on. Examples of how he words things, okay? He was talking about the people who paralyze their hair with spray, like what a great image, like your hair is stuck that way, sunlit cars blazed, a double-stranded necklace on the distant main road, like I said, he finds the perfect metaphor for some of these things that again it isn't just, hey, this is a cool way to give you a visual of what this looks like, but in almost all these cases there's an underlying meaning that we connect to those words that also suggests something unsettling or eerie about them as well, that we're getting this cool image and we're seeing it a very specific way based on the language he uses. And then on top of that, we're also being guided toward a very specific feeling, this sort of growing sense of dread, the sense of unease. And to me, different horror stories serve different purposes, but the primary one is either to horrify or terrify. And to me, like splatterpunk and extreme horror, that's a horrify kind of story. Quiet horror is more of a terrify kind of story, and that's kind of more what I gravitate toward. And I think that's what he does. Sometimes they're slow burns. Sometimes they unfold. Like he mentions in one case, the week unfolded wearily. But that's kind of what his stories do, is that they unfold slowly, and you get this growing sense of dread, which I just absolutely love. So to me, I mean, if you are a fan of quiet horror at all, he's one of the masters. He really is, and I aspire to be that awesome someday. So that's it for this week. I hope you enjoyed listening. If you like listening to this episode of Cosmic Shenanigans, you can listen to past and present and future episodes of Cosmic Shenanigans on Google Play, iTunes, Spotify, Stitcher, now on YouTube, on the Brian Keene YouTube channel. They're reissued on those. And all other places where podcasts are available. You can listen to it for free. If you enjoy listening to me on Cosmic Shenanigans, you may also listen to true shenanigans that we get up to on The Horror Show with Brian Keene, which I co-host with Brian Keene. If you want to show engineer Dave Thomas some love, you can check out his Twitch channel at twitch.tv/meteornotes, where he talks to his kitties and plays video games and gets up to shenanigans of his own. And if you would like to advertise on Cosmic Shenanigans, go to the Project Entertainment Network button, and there's the Project Entertainment Network website. There is a button in the top right-hand corner, I believe. You can click on that, and it will contact Armand Rosamilia, who's in charge of our ads, and you can do an ad through them that way. Okay? Thanks for listening, and I will see you again next week. Bye.
Three Guys with Beards.
The usual gang of idiots. That's me, Christopher Golden.
New York Times best-selling authors.
My name is Jim Moore.
Interviews with pop culture stars and creators.
I'm Jonathan Mayberry.
And they don't talk about politics.
Course of human events.
Jesus, let's not talk about the course of human events today.
I said they don't talk about politics.
I suspect we may bend our rule about no politics on the Beards and talk about politics of the Beards.
Didn't you say they don't talk about politics?
If somebody else says something, we should...
Thank you.
Can anyone hear me? Am I all alone here?
Three Guys with Beards.
Tuesdays, exclusively on Project Entertainment Network.